What if the story you've been telling yourself about who you are has been quietly holding you back? For 30 years, I told myself I was not the kind of person who asks for help. I said it directly when it seemed relevant. I'm fine, I can manage. I said it indirectly more often, arriving early, staying late, preparing more than was necessary, performing a competence so thorough that it preempted the need for anyone to offer. I told it to myself constantly, in the quiet monitoring voice that runs beneath conscious thought, checking and rechecking. You are handling this. You don't need anyone. You are fine. The story had a quality of truth because I was managing, was handling it, was fine, in the narrow sense that I wasn't falling apart. But the story had other implications that I wasn't interrogating, that asking meant weakness, that needing meant failure, that the best version of me was the version that required nothing from anyone. The story had a history, the way stories always have histories. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as the oldest of 4 children and the only daughter, with a mother who worked 2 jobs after my father left when I was 9, and who taught me, through example rather than instruction, that the way you survive is by not stopping. Not stopping, not asking, not showing the places where you are thin. My mother was a remarkable woman, and I do not blame her for this lesson. She was doing the best she could with impossible circumstances. I am simply telling you what I learned by watching her, and what I applied for 40 years without examining, without asking whether it was still true, without considering that a story that served me at 9 might be slowly suffocating me at 30, at 40, at 50. My name is Catherine Morales. I am 70 years old. I was a social worker in Albuquerque for 32 years. Child Protective Services, family intervention, the hardest end of the helping profession. And the irony of this is not lost on me, that I spent 3 decades helping people ask for the help they needed, while being personally constituted by a story that made asking impossible. I went to work every day, and I helped vulnerable families identify their needs. I connected them to services. I coached them through the shame and resistance that often accompanies asking for help. And then I went home and I did everything myself, and I told myself I was fine. The story didn't break all at once. It developed a crack, and then a larger one, and then in 2018 it became structurally unsound, and I had to decide what to do with the structure. Let me tell you about the crack. In 2015, my husband Jorge was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He was 62. It was early stage, managed for the first 2 years with medication and monitoring, and I managed our response to it the way I managed everything, by becoming more competent. I researched Parkinson's with the focus I brought to case files. I attended every appointment. I adapted our home. I adjusted our routines. I learned to anticipate what was coming and to prepare for it. And I did this with the efficiency of a person who has been not stopping for 40 years. The diagnosis was frightening, but I could manage frightening. I could manage the disease. I could manage the future. What I did not do was let anyone know how hard it was. I did not let anyone help with the managing. I did not let the weight show. Our daughter Rosa asked, regularly and directly, how I was doing. I said, fine. Our son Marcus asked. I said, fine. My closest friend Alicia asked. I said, fine. The social worker who had conducted 100 client interviews in which she patiently demonstrated that fine is not an answer, was answering her own daughter's inquiries with fine, because the story I had been telling myself for 40 years was still running, still narrating, still insisting that not needing was the measure of being all right. I remember Rosa's face when I said it. She would look at me with a kind of frustrated love, the expression of someone who could see the lie and who was unsure whether to call me on it. In 2018, Jorge's disease progressed into a phase that required continuous attention. He fell 3 times in the first 6 months of that year. The falls were frightening. Not catastrophically, he was not badly hurt, but they were frightening in the way that any physical deterioration is frightening when you love the body in question. The falls were also evidence that the disease was accelerating, that the trajectory was steeper than we had been told, that I was not managing this the way I thought I was managing it. I began sleeping less. I began eating less reliably. I stopped seeing Alicia regularly because the time was needed elsewhere. I lost weight. My hands developed a tremor from stress and fatigue. I looked in the mirror and saw someone I didn't recognize, thin, exhausted, held together by will alone. Rosa came to visit in October of 2018. She stayed for 5 days, and on the 4th day she sat down with me after Jorge was asleep, and she said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "I know you say that. I want to ask you to stop saying that for 10 minutes. This is my daughter, who is 41, and who spent her childhood watching me not stop. She has her own life and her own strength, and she looked at me that evening with the particular directness of a person who has rehearsed what she needs to say. She had thought about it. She had prepared. She was done. She said, "You are disappearing. I can see it. You've lost weight and you're not sleeping, and you stopped calling Alicia, and you haven't been to book club in 4 months. And every time I ask how you are, you say fine, and you are clearly not fine. I am not asking you to have a breakdown. I'm asking you to tell me one true thing." I sat with that for a long moment. One true thing. It was such a simple request. It was also the most difficult thing anyone had asked me to do in 40 years. To name out loud to someone who loved me that I was not managing, that I was drowning, that the story I had been telling was a lie, and I was exhausted from keeping it up. The one true thing was this: I was exhausted in a way that was past exhaustion. I was not sleeping more than 4 hours. I had stopped reading, which I had done every evening of my adult life. That steady, quiet pleasure of being inside a book that was the one luxury I had maintained. I was frightened, not of Jorge's disease, which I understood clinically, but of the version of myself that was emerging from the caretaking, thin and unrecognizable, the person who had been managing so hard and so long that there was nothing left underneath the management. I was frightened that if I asked for help, I would fall apart. I was frightened that I had become incapable of being anything other than competent. I was frightened that the story I had been living in since I was 9 years old was the only story I knew how to tell. I said that, not all of it at once, not cleanly. It came out halted and incomplete, the way things come out when you haven't said them and they've been waiting. But I said it. I said I was exhausted and frightened, and that I didn't know who I was outside of taking care of people, because I had been taking care of people since I was 9 years old. That I had been taking care of my younger siblings after my father left. That I had been taking care of my mother while she worked 2 jobs. That I had been taking care of patients for 30 years. That I had been taking care of Jorge. That there was no version of me that was separate from the managing, and I didn't know how to exist without it, and the prospect of trying was more frightening than the prospect of continuing as I was. Rosa held my hand. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Okay, now we're going to figure out what help looks like." We did. It took several weeks and several difficult conversations, and the letting go of the story that not needing is strength. Alicia came back. Rosa arranged a regular respite schedule. I started seeing a therapist. Me, the social worker, the person who referred people to therapy for 30 years. I started sleeping more. The weight came back. The tremor in my hands stopped. Slowly, across the months, I became less like a person at the end of their rope and more like a person who remembered how to live. Jorge died in 2021. He was peaceful. I was with him. The time we had in that last year was different because I was present to it rather than managing it from a distance. I was there instead of disappearing. And I want to tell you what the story of not needing had cost me, because I think you might be carrying a version of it. The story I had been telling, that I was not the kind of person who asks for help, was protecting something real. It was protecting the little girl whose mother worked 2 jobs and who learned that the way you survive is by not stopping. That story was survival at 9. At 70, it was something else. It had outlived its usefulness by 60 years, and I had never noticed, because the story fit the life I'd built, and the life I'd built fit the story. And when a thing is circular, it can run indefinitely without requiring examination. The question I want to ask you is, what is the story you have been telling yourself about who you are, and how old is it? Stories form in specific circumstances from specific experiences, and they serve us in those circumstances. But we carry them long past the circumstances that created them, and the stories that kept us safe at 9 or 19 or 29 may be the ones that are keeping us small at 69. The story that we should be independent, where does that come from? The story that asking is weakness, who taught you that? The story that you should be able to handle it, what made you believe that? These stories are not truth, they are history, and history can be revised. I am not asking you to abandon who you are. I am asking you to check whether the story of who you are is current, whether it still fits, or whether you've been wearing it past its usefulness, because changing it requires admitting that it was necessary to begin with. Whether you might be disappearing while telling yourself you're fine. The story changed for me. I am still competent, still capable, still the person my family relies on. But I am also the person who calls Alicia when I'm having a hard day, who lets Rosa help, who goes to therapy and calls it useful. Both versions exist. The second one is not a diminishment of the first. She's an addition. She's a completion. Please subscribe and stay. Leave a comment about the story you've been telling yourself, the one that might need examining, the one that might have been true once and isn't anymore. Hit the like button if this reached you. Share this with someone who says fine when they mean something else. Share this with someone who is disappearing while insisting they're managing. A book that helped me understand the stories we carry was The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. It is about trauma and the way it lives in us, but it is also about the stories we build to survive it and what it means to revise them. The link is in the description. My name is Catherine Morales. I am 70 years old. I asked for help in 2018. It was the hardest and most necessary thing I have done in this decade of my life.